Hello and welcome. My name is Yongjun Baek of the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. And before we get started, I have a few announcements about how the webinar will be conducted. For our audience participants, microphones will be in mute mode and videos are off. If there are any questions from the audience, would you kindly type them using the Q&A function? And please also include your name and affiliation, and the moderator will be ready to answer your questions during the Q&A period. For today's speakers, would you kindly ensure your videos and microphones are off? When you are about to present or answer a question, please turn both microphone and video off. After you have finished speaking, please turn both off again. Guidelines for the time are indicated on the circulated agenda. Also, moderators will be announcing your allocated time before you speak. Kindly try to keep within the allocated time as we have a full schedule today. Also, an evaluation survey would have been sent to your emails. It is a short survey, so please give us your feedback through the survey. Before we begin, could I ask all the speakers to turn on their videos for a group photo of the webinars? Now, I would like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Linda Arthur, Senior Capacity Building and Training Specialist at the Asian Development Bank Institute.
Thank you, Yongjun. Hello and welcome, distinguished speakers and audience members, to ADBI's webinar series, Casting Wider Safety Nets, Real-Time Policy Recommendations During the COVID-19 Pandemic. This is the third and final webinar in the series. Before we get started with today's program, allow me to briefly recap from webinar 2. We heard from the ILO South Asia office about migrant workers forced to return due to lockdowns. In particular, this situation in South Asia is very serious, as it accounts for 1/3 of the world's migrant workers, many of which do not have access to social protection schemes for the poor in their home countries. The scale of the crisis for migrant workers and loss of remittances has required governments to take notice. In South Asia, only one country has an actual policy on returning migrant workers. A whole of government approach is required to address this issue, both at country and regional levels. We also heard a real-time case study from the government of the Philippines, which faces the enormous task of scaling up a cash transfer program from 4.4 million to 18 million poor households. They are currently grappling with 3 major issues in parallel: targeting, validating recipients, and payment delivery. Among the findings is that moving forward or toward paperless registration can remove delays and subjectivity in deciding on eligibility. Also, the government is partnering with private companies to expand digital cash payments. Finally, the president of China's CD Finance joined us, but due to technical difficulties, we were not able to listen to his remarks. I will go through the salient points of his presentation in the Q&A session. Now, let us begin with today's agenda. We have a slight change to our agenda in the order of the first and second speakers, since the second speaker is urgently called to a meeting. Therefore, he will go first. He is Amitabh Kant, presently CEO of the National Institution for Transforming India, also known as Niti Aayog. He is a member of the Indian Administrative Service, IAS, Kerala Cadre, 1980 batch. He is the author of Branding India, an incredible story, and has edited The Path Ahead, Transformative Ideas for India. Kant has been a key driver of the Make in India, Startup India, Incredible India, and God's Own Country initiatives that positioned India and Kerala state as leading manufacturing and tourism destinations. These campaigns have won several international awards and embraced a host of activities: infrastructure development, product enhancement, private-public partnership, and positioning and branding based on extensive market research. Mr. Kant will be presenting the live case study from India and India's response through social safety nets to the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Kant, the floor is yours, and would you kindly complete your remarks in approximately 15 minutes? Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to participate in this webinar. And since independence, actually India has been implementing a very comprehensive development strategy to end poverty in all forms through accelerated economic growth. We have had a wide range of programs for promoting gainful employment, strengthening livelihood opportunities, and improving accessibility of citizens to basic services such as health, nutrition, drinking water, and sanitation. The mechanism for targeted social assistance to vulnerable populations are also being improved on a continual basis. We've had a multi-pronged strategy, and targeted government programs have facilitated income growth for the economically disadvantaged by developing infrastructure and support services. Social protection measures and mitigation of risks from natural and other disasters ensure that unforeseen exigencies do not disrupt the poverty reduction efforts. However, this particular crisis has been of massive proportions. I just wanted to give you a perspective of what our financial inclusion strategy hitherto has been. For the unbanked sections of population, we've been able to achieve financial inclusion through what we call JAM Trinity, that is the biometric system which links up banks, credit, insurance, pension fund under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana. And as of the April 2020, we've had 381 million accounts were opened. These were no-frills accounts which were opened, and almost 200 out of these 381 million, almost 203 million of them were opened by women of India. And the increased overall coverage of banking with this Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana has enabled direct benefit transfer. We've been able to put direct money into their bank account of almost 10 trillion to the accounts of beneficiary, which improves the effectiveness of social security provisions. As per the World Bank's global index on banking, we've almost 55% of the bank accounts opened during 2014 and 17 were opened in India. And therefore, this has been one of the key drivers of our growth. Every bank account linked with biometric, almost 55% of the world bank accounts being opened in India, and within India, almost 60% of them, over 60% of them for women. We also focused on universalizing primary health care. We've one is opening up 150,000 health and wellness center at grassroots level, and also by strengthening the initiation of what we call the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, that is insurance scheme. We complement the component under the Ayushman Bharat, which covers, for the first time, we've had a coverage of 500 million beneficiaries from over 100 million poor and vulnerable families, with health insurance coverage up to Indian rupees 500,000 per family, because in India, a vast number of families go below poverty line. So we've covered over 10 million hospital treatments. We've had a huge amount of a linkage of public and private hospitals, which have been impaneled, over 20,000 public and private hospitals, which have been impaneled across the country to provide inpatient services to the beneficiary. We've also had access to safe housing as a very critical part of our essential services, which ensures under the scheme of housing for all by 2022. The economically disadvantaged households are provided with financial assistance for constructing houses equipped with basic amenities. We've also strengthened livelihood opportunities and skilling ecosystem and to increase the income levels of low income groups through better skilling opportunities and more productive employment. India has introduced measures and programs such as Stand Up India, Skill India, National Apprenticeship Program, and National Rural and Urban Livelihood Mission. And therefore, as a consequence of this, the share of regular wage employees has increased very sharply from about 18% in 2011-12 to over 24% in about 2017-18. And this has made a huge difference. Women participation in regular wage jobs also has seen a huge growth. Now, we've had, the other thing I want to focus on is the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, because India continues to pursue a national development agenda which is inclusive at the core. Our objective is to ensure that underlying principle of the development agenda remains focused on reducing poverty, raising incomes, improving living standards, and enhancing the ease of living of all communities while leaving no one behind. And the increase in expenditure on social service sector affirms the commitment of government towards social well-being. So we've had a huge challenge with the coming in of COVID-19 crisis. Our challenge was to ensure that people below the poverty line are not impacted. And therefore, India launched the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. It's a package of about Indian rupee 1.7 trillion. What the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana implies is to assist and support, target the poor and migrant population. It offers an insurance coverage of Indian rupee 5 million per health workers. It gives free food for 800 million people. It gives social security net of Indian rupees 6,000 for 200 million women. It gives ex gratia of Indian rupee 1,000 to 30 million elderly widows and people with disabilities, farmers and construction workers. It's one of the biggest programs of its kind for poor and migrant population. So this has been the basic thrust of the government through the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. In addition, the Prime Minister launched what he called the Self-Reliant India program, that is Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan or Self-Reliant India movement. The intention was that global supply chains will get impacted, and therefore the clarion call was that while we'll be an integral part of the global supply chain, it is important to our vision must be to translate immediate COVID-19 related policy measures to bring about transformative changes in the country. And this was based on 5 pillars. Economy, which brings in quantum leap and incremental change, and therefore a series of radical reforms were conceptualized. Infrastructure, which should become the identity of the country. Thirdly, system based on 21st century technology driven arrangements, and technology will be the key driver of growth. Fourthly, vibrant demography, the source of human capital and potential, and demand, fifthly, the strength of the country's demand and supply chain will be utilized to full capacity. And then presented in 5 tranches by the finance minister. I would just give you some highlights of this. We had a short-term and long-term measures to ensure that no one in India is left behind. Our objective was to leverage technology to create a geographically independent one nation, one ration card. That is, every individual living in the country can move from one place to another, but should be able to get food, basic food items. India is a very vast country. It's bigger than 25 countries of Europe. People move from one place to another, but they should be able to get food. And therefore, this was critical, and what we have done is through one card, one nation platform, which is totally digital in nature, we'll be able to supply food. Additional 400 billion Indian rupee, that is US dollar 5.33 billion, has been provided for rural employment to generate 3 billion persons day of employment. There's a scheme for affordable rental housing complexes for migrant workers and urban poor. And migrant workers are very critical for India. A lot of them move from rural areas to urban area, and therefore there has been a lot of focus on them. We provided about 666.7 million US dollar credit facility for street vendors, and we are fully digitalizing them. We provided emergency working capital for farmers. We provided concessional credit boost to 25 million farmers of about 26.7 billion US dollars. And we provided about US dollar 800 million for afforestation and plantation works to create jobs. We've also focused on healthcare reforms and investments for insurance cover, for teleconsultation services, for increased public expenditure, ramping up health and wellness centers in rural and urban India. We've also provided relief and credit support related to businesses, that is emergency working capital facility for business, including medium, small, and micro enterprises. We've tried to focus on a fund for MSMEs, and then provided special liquidity scheme for NBFCs, HFCs. So we have looked at a whole process, and then measures to strengthen our agriculture, fisheries, and food processing. How do we fund for farm gate infrastructure for farmers? We've provided money for fishermen, for animal husbandry, and our attempt has been that we should take care of everyone below the poverty line, people who are most impacted, so that we get them back into this whole cycle of economic growth. Our objective has been to implement a comprehensive development strategy to ensure that people who are worst impacted by COVID-19 don't get into this vicious cycle of poverty, but become self-entrepreneurs, and we are able to provide jobs for them and take them above poverty line. So a multi-pronged strategy, targeted government programs, which will facilitate income growth for the economically disadvantaged by developing infrastructure and support services. So with these few words, I will conclude. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kant, for those words. Would you have time for one question?
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe we have a staff from the Asian Development Bank from the South Asia Regional Department, Ms. Sunhua Lee, and she also works on the India program. So if Ms. Lee is there, would you like to go ahead, please?
Good afternoon, Mr. Kant.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you very much for your very informative and insightful presentation on the ongoing initiatives by the government of India. As you may also know, ADB responded expeditiously to the government's request to finance emergency relief programs. In late April, only 1 month after the national lockdown in India and the PM's announcement of relief packages, ADB board approved a 1.5 billion loan to support the country's immediate priorities. And this included what you just mentioned, those comprehensive safety net programs, such as food assistance through PDS, cash transfers to women through Jan Dhan accounts, and then to farmers through the PM Kisan scheme and so on. And from the ongoing implementation and delivery of this safety net benefits, despite its comprehensiveness, there seem to be some emerging areas pointing to, potential gaps and further improvement in the existing safety nets. And the issue of migrant workers and through the ration card has been well known. And I would appreciate if you could share your views on first, what will be the early key lessons from the government's recent efforts in supporting the poor and vulnerable through the existing safety net programs and schemes. And the second is given emerging gaps in the existing system, what will be the strategic directions that the government is likely to take to improve and further strengthen the overall social protection system? As you know now, it will be more essential for the poor and vulnerable population to build their resilience for future economic and health shocks. Thank you
for that, for those very excellent remarks that you have made, because we really want to compliment ADB, the Asian Development Bank, for its very prompt and immediate action in providing the support to India in the context of COVID-19. But more than that, Asian Development Bank works with us on the aspirational district program, which covers about 115 of our most backward districts. We don't call them backward, we call them aspirational districts of India. And ADB's support has led to our transforming some of the most backward districts of India in education, health, nutrition. Those are really the key. My personal view is that India has a very strong social security network for the rural areas through the Manrega program, where we provide work. We've also provided food, additional food to the workers in rural areas. But we have a major challenge as far as the urban poor is concerned. And I think that's emerging as one of our biggest challenges, because urban areas have a very unique ecosystem. And a lot of people from rural areas move to urban areas. And what we are now focusing on is a specific scheme and a specific mission for urban poor. We need to tackle this issue to take care of them. We need to tackle the issue of providing housing for migrant workers. We need to make them more formalized from informal sector. And several challenges are emerging in these areas. And that is why we are trying to evolve and innovate as far as our labor laws are concerned. And we need to ensure that they are able to get housing, they are able to get food, and they are able to get good quality work. And these are some of the challenges which are emerging, and we'll be very happy to work with Asian Development Bank in some of these key areas to take it forward so that the vulnerable section is not impacted in future. We'll be very happy to partner Asian Development Bank in all these areas. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for your response. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kant, I understand that you have been called away to an urgent meeting in the government, but I wanted to just thank you sincerely for taking your time to share with us today the very compelling case study from India. It is very good to know that India has launched such a comprehensive development strategy in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that you have mobilized such a huge package of assistance to migrant workers, health workers, rural, to assist rural employment, and small businesses, just to name a few. So on behalf of the Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute and the Deputy Dean, I would like to thank you again and very much look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you, Mr. Kant.
Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate it. It was a great pleasure for me to participate in this wonderful webinar.
Thank you, sir. And now we will move on with today's program. In each of our webinars, we have been looking at a particular group and the particular circumstances of specific vulnerable groups under the COVID-19 pandemic, and the containment measures that affected them so harshly. Today, we'll be looking at women's livelihoods and how the crisis has placed their safety nets at risk. Our speaker is Ms. Tsunami Tanaka. She is the chief of the Gender Equity Thematic Group at the Asian Development Bank. She oversees and provides advice on ADB-financed public and private sector investment projects across sectors and themes in support of gender equality and women's empowerment in Asia and the Pacific. Tsunami has worked on gender and development, poverty reduction, social analysis, social protection, and community participation issues in Asia and the Pacific for over 20 years. She has worked in the World Bank's South Asia Department and in development institutions in Japan. Tsunami, would you please go ahead with your presentation? Thank you.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Tsunami Tanaka. I have been the chief on gender of ADB's operation, and I'm on my way from September, early October to Lao PDR to take up a new assignment as a country director there. And it's my great pleasure also to see real people after long time of lockdown. I'm here in Tokyo at ADBI, and really appreciate the invitation that has been extended by ADBI. Thank you so much. So today I'm going to take about 15 minutes to talk about the three major things. The one is about what have been the major gendered impact, socioeconomic impact of COVID-19, and on particularly women's livelihoods and safety nets. And the second part is to talk about what has been implication of these impacts onto the social protection and social assistance designs. And I will be talking about the examples in different countries that ADB has been supporting, and it's very difficult to go after Mr. Kant, who has been very specific about the program. So I will also add the other countries' examples through ADB's assistance. And then finally, in the third area I'm going to talk about is what is beyond COVID-19 in terms of social assistance to women and girls and gender equality as a whole. So I'm starting with my first slide, which is about how to, what has been the key socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 on women and girls particularly, but in terms of a gender differentiated patterns of impact. And there are 5 major areas that I can highlight. And so one level, of course, is the major massive loss of jobs and livelihoods and businesses that have been particularly felt acute among women and girls in some of the hard-hit sectors, such as the service sector, retail, hospitality, tourism, and also some of the garment and other manufacturing industries, as well as, of course, when you compare between the formal and informal sector, it is the informal sector. And the fact that the women occupy pretty much the informal economy and informal employment, and for example, in currently South Asia, non-agricultural women's workforce, it's 80% of the informal sector is women. So it has a major implication. And I'd like to remind all of you that the gender gaps in the labor market already existed in terms of a labor force participation rate, as well as the wage gaps. And so that means that the women at labor force already have a major disadvantage and having a very limited coping capacity when crisis hits. And if you look at the history in the past of any kind of crisis, you see that the women are normally the first to lose the jobs and the last to gain back the jobs. And I'd like to just show you one example of emerging evidence. It is very difficult to show at the moment of the the last 3 months, for example, of surveys. But this is one example when the snapshot of UN Women has done the surveys in 6 Asia Pacific countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Philippines, and Thailand. And this is one of the data that they have collected in April. It was done for the impact on jobs for men and women differently. And the blue you can see is for female, and the red one is for male. So, unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into details, but you can see the patterns that both in the informal employment and the formal employment, women in blue are losing out more than men. And particularly what's really very unique in Bangladesh, this is the Bangladesh example, is that the formal employment, women are far more hit than the men, and this is primarily coming from the garment, ready-made garment sector. The second channel of impact has been the increase in the unpaid care and domestic work burden. And so women have been already bearing the most of the unpaid care and domestic work burden, but with the lockdown, also school closing and so on, this has been become more acute. And that the burden has been on both men and women, but obviously you can imagine that the women are bearing more burden. But since this has become so aware, this has become such a big issue for both men and women, we need to bring forward the agenda even after the lockdown is released. The increase in domestic violence has been also being reported elsewhere. It is very difficult to get the actual data, to collect the data, but some of the emerging examples in the developed countries, like in Denmark, there was a 15% increase in some of the US data, and a 20% increase in receiving of the online services and helpline for domestic violence and the violence against women calls. And so even without the COVID, the gender-based violence has been a major issue in Asia Pacific country. So this is another area of a major influence. The fourth area is that the interrupted reproductive health services, because a lot of attention has been paid for COVID-related healthcare services. And then finally, in healthcare, workers have been at major risk, and the 70% globally of the health workers are women, and this is a major area when we talk about the safety net. So what has been all this implication for the designing of the social safety nets and social assistance in these Asia Pacific countries? So many of the examples have been actually already identified and explained in India's case. They're very comprehensive by Mr. Kant. But so this is more of a sort of categorizing what are the types. So the cash and other transfers, there have been the two ways of providing the cash transfers and then other in-kind transfers. One way is to do is to target individuals, and targeting women and girls can be easily done in a particular women and girls in a particular situation, such as pregnant women, widows, and women with disability. And in India, Indonesia, and a couple of other countries have supported through their budget support. And through households transfers, we should not assume that the transfer that we provide to households are equally distributed within the household between men and women, boys and girls. So it is important when we think about the women's empowerment in cash transfer or the in-kind transfers. We need to think about that women to be the recipients, women given the ID card and become the recipients of a household cash transfer. For example, in the Philippines and in Pakistan, a major cash transfer programs, the targeted channel through women's names and bank accounts. At the also in-kind support, the type of in-kind support, for example, food support can quite often managed within the women within the households once it goes to the households, but also the in-kind support like a free cooking gas cylinders in India this was part of the package, and this is extremely helpful, particularly for women who are within the household, the major manager of cooking gas and the cooking energy. And the second area is a temporary job creation, which is not so many because, I mean, as you can imagine, under lockdown, you cannot really create additional jobs, but this is more for the recovery phase. So that, as Mr. Kant already mentioned, Rega, the rural and also the urban employment guarantee schemes, which has the gender target, and then through ADB support, we set at least 50% women to be the targeted beneficiaries. And it's very important to set the female targets. So at least that the current access that women have in these services will not go down when additional services are provided. Another areas that this is also what Mr. Khan talked about is the support to businesses and enterprises, and micro, small, medium enterprises. And there has been many different ways that this has been provided, but it is also important to monitor what how much goes to women-led enterprises or to the type of enterprises that employ more women, such as the garment sector and so on. There are many different ways that this has been done, and through the tax exemption or the loan payments deferrals and then employee wage subsidies. Support to health workers have been also extremely important, and from gender perspectives as well. Through insurance coverage in the Philippines and India, we have supported that. Cash incentives to stay in the for the health sector workers to stay, which was done through in Tajikistan. And also in the Philippines, we have made the design feature so that the health workers have access within the hospital that are working in to have the room for that they do lactating, but also to have the childcare during the daytime. And finally, and very importantly, the violence against women and the reproductive health services support are crucial. So these are the examples that were included in ADB supported programs, and then somewhat also already mentioned, like India, we supported through 1.5 billion COVID-19 pandemic response option, and we have been doing that already. ADB approved it for 9 countries, which typically has the health sector support, social assistance, and economic stimulus packages. And so we have done 9 countries, but also 23 more countries in pipeline. And we have integrated this gender targeting mechanisms that I have mentioned earlier. And also the government of these countries have agreed to, many of them have agreed to have a close monitoring of a gender impact through the gender monitoring matrix. In addition to this, ADB has been providing very targeted support for women and girls through technical assistance projects, through maternal child care, reproductive health, and gender-based violence response, and through private sector operation. We have been encouraging the companies client companies to enhance the child care and family-friendly workplace policies, because as you can see, the increased burden of the care, unpaid care and domestic work burden on particularly women employees are quite severe. So some of the client companies have been volunteering to support these women employees, as well as some of the companies we've been supporting are producing the medical equipment. So when they produce the PPE, the personal protective equipment, they have agreed that the size will be wide enough so that because female health workers have been complaining that sometimes that the wrongly fit size PPEs have been putting them at risk. So moving ahead, it's very important that we just don't stop at the emergency responses and looking at gender issues and women and girls as vulnerable, but we need to go back to our bigger issue of continuing our efforts of narrowing existing gender gaps, and promoting gender equality and empowering women and girls. So moving forward from the social safety net perspective, there are a couple of important points. One is that the importance of focusing on the informal sector and designing the social protection. And so COVID-19 has made us aware that unless we have already a system, social protection system in the country, it is very difficult to do it in a very quick way. And through that, we need to focus more on the informal sector. And secondly, the importance of the care economy and the implications for that, how that is important for women's empowerment has been felt by globally. And this care economy would include elderly care, child care, domestic care, and both paid and unpaid care. And skill support for future work for women is particularly crucial because there will be a major change in terms of a demand from the labor market, and more higher value adding sectors, more digitization of the economy, science, technology, engineering, math, rather than women in the traditional sectors. More the new types of skills development and education system need to be developed. And women-led and micro, small, medium enterprises continue to be supported, but it is shown that only finance is not sufficient. It also needs to be mixed with the private sector support and the capacity building of these enterprises. Women's leadership, crucial. There has been some debates about countries with the women heads have been much better in performing and managing, like New Zealand case of the COVID situation, where there are pros and cons, and there's debate about it. But important thing is that making sure that women are involved as a group in mass, critical mass, to continue to be involved in the decision-making process. And gender-based violence, reproductive health services, we need to maintain and increase actually the public and the private investments in this area. And then finally, the importance of tracking gender data. Because without the evidence, we cannot really show what has been the real impact, what will be the moving forward beyond COVID-19. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sonome, for such a comprehensive talk about the effects on women of the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, I was very glad that you highlighted that transfers to households, both financial and in-kind, should focus on women as recipients. And also that you highlighted job creation and retraining as important features in recovery, because as we all know, we may have not just temporary unemployment, but permanent job losses as a result of the pandemic. And finally, that ADB has provided targeted support to women in such a broad range of developing member countries as a response to the shock of COVID-19. So thank you again, Sonome, and would you please also stand by for the panel discussion later? Okay. Now, continuing with our program, I would like to move to our next segment on moving from emergency to recovery. And in this sense, we want to also focus on how we can capture the momentum of what has occurred among so many countries, so many developing member countries, with their safety net responses, and how we can capture this as an opportunity, you may say, to go forward to strengthen social protection systems in future. And to give us an idea of how we can do this, We have invited Professor Hokju Kwon, and he is the president of the Korean Association of International Development and Cooperation and professor at the Graduate School of Public Administration and the Asia Development Institute at the Seoul National University. His research interest is in global social policy, international development cooperation, and political theory of social policy. He was co-editor of Global Social Policy, author of Bring Back Institutional Capability in Fragile Situations, Implications for Global Social Policy, Transforming the Developmental Welfare State, and Implications of the Sustainable Development Goals for Global Social Policy. Professor Kwon, would you please give your presentation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for very, very generous introduction. And I'd like to also express my gratitude for this opportunity to share my thoughts on social safety net beyond COVID-19. Well, I think the COVID-19 is a really big hit emergency situation for us. But this is the emergency situation. And I think we need to think beyond COVID-19 to establish the better social safety net in developing country in East Asia. So that is my topic today. Well, how can I? Okay, thank you very much. I will say to you that to turn the page on. So just before I move to East Asia, I'd like to set my presentation and my thought in the global context, because this COVID-19 is very much a global phenomena, global crisis. And also when we think about the response in the long term, I think we need to consider this global context and the global change. But I will be very brief on this part. Well, we know that the pandemic is really very big. And one very important and very, very surprising thing is that many affluent societies in OECD have different ability to respond. And probably you also share with my surprise that some countries like US or Italy and UK really could not up to my expectation to respond to this crisis. But at the same time, South Korea, Germany, and many other developing countries also different response, but some are better response to this crisis. But one really the thing we see in many other in many countries in common is a huge increase in poverty because of the coronavirus itself, but also lockdown policy and the slowdown economic activities. After, I mean, this coronavirus immediate crisis, we now think about what is the long-term economic impact of this. And I think this is really important for us to think in the developing countries as well. And one thing I like to bring out in this context is that the many countries will see more their national interest first over global public good. For the last 20 or 30 years, the global community has put many energies and resources to achieve global public goods, such as Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goal. We mobilized our resource to climate change. And also we try to build a global production chain to have a more efficient economy. And now I think the country will think again about this attitude about the globalization and their national interest. This, I think, will have a huge impact on the world and the global economy after the crisis, immediate crisis. So that is my context. Next page. Thank you very much. Okay, so now let's move into Asia. I just mentioned South Korea. And the one thing is that our immediate response and prevention of the virus was very good, but I think it is not yet finished. I think we need to be alert, and we should be careful about the second wave of the virus infection, which may come in August or in fall. But that is one thing. But other countries in East Asia, many developing countries, they show very swift and also very decisive action to prevent the virus infection. That I think it was very impressive. So they impose international travel ban and the control of domestic travel and movement to prevent the virus infection. But I have to say that that's not very adequate because the travel ban and control of movement is a second order prevention. Really, the work to prevent the virus is that we need to test, we need to trace, and also we need to separate the people infected with the virus and then cure them in hospital. But in the developing countries context, this is very weak. The ability to take care of this threat is very weak. We have to know that. So we need to be careful. We shouldn't be complacent about the next wave of virus. So when I talk to policy after beyond COVID-19, is that I'm not saying that we can think beyond COVID-19 without really thinking about second wave of virus infection. So my starting point is that thinking ahead, but still we need to put our foot on the place in firm ground. Because of this, the response to prevent coronavirus, there is huge economic and social impact that are mainly very negative in developing countries. So, for example, formal workers working in large scale firms or working in the public sector, working in more established sectors, still they have problems because of the lockdown, because of slowdown economic activities. The country with the formal sector workers are part of the global production chain. Their work is a stop and go and is a slow down. And also in the future, we can anticipate a reduction of demand in the global market. So the economy will be slowed down, but that is the formal workers. But informal workers, the situation will be much more difficult because they are already in the precarious situation. And some of the informal workers are already lost their job. And also we will see many of people lose their job or their work is disappear. So things will be very difficult. I think that this is really important aspect, not only within the national economy, but in the context of global economy, in terms of the economic development of the developing countries. We will see this international migrant workers coming back home, and they will not have opportunity again quickly to go back to their old workers to earn income and to send the money back home, which will be a vital source of the economic development and the investment. And overall, not only developing countries, but after COVID-19, I mean, I think many countries, probably most of the country, will put their efforts to recover, but we will see the global economy will be very much slowed down. So next, please. Well, now move into more specific response. This is my quick survey of the Asian countries' response to the global pandemic, economic response. The Philippines, we already discussed about the Philippines program, 4P programs. It covers 18 million households. Indonesia has a PKH program, 10 million recipients plus 9 million households. And we also have Mongolia and Vietnam, and we have this cash transfer to the poor. These are the programs to immediate response after the crisis. But here we can observe very important thing as well. So the first, there are issues. These cash transfer programs, whether we should use a conditional cash transfer or unconditional cash transfer. Because the conditional cash transfer has a problem of exclusion error. Still, in the time of crisis, in the time of emergency, it is very, very difficult to include the people, every people, include in this protection. So some are left out, this the cash transfer program. So our response may be unconditional cash transfer. That is one way. But here, I like to point out that the Philippines and Indonesia, their cash transfer program in this pandemic crisis, but these programs were already implemented before. So in the Philippines, in Indonesia, they have an institutional framework. For example, they have an administrative data set to start with, to identify the poor who really suffer from the crisis. That I think we need to really take from this episode. So next, please. Then we have another big debate in terms of the social response to coronavirus, but in the wider context of social protection in developing countries, we have this issue of missing middle. So in the developing countries, we have social security for the public sector and formal sector. They occupy the higher segment of income groups. So they are people in the income deciles. And now, in the time of crisis, we were talking about the cash transfer program, emergency relief. But how about the people in the middle who really also suffer from the income loss during the time of crisis? Some of them already informal sector. So these are the really important issues, and which is not only here in the crisis, but important issue in social protection in developing countries. But the question is that if this is really the gap, then what kind of response, what kind of policy response we can have, what kind of institution will be necessary. So one big issue at the moment is a universal basic income. So basic income for everyone. Is a kind of unconditional cash transfer for everyone. So I know that this is very popular at the time of implementation. Okay, if you give me some money, why not? I will happily receive it. But the question is that do we have, as a government, do we have enough money? Do we have enough public finance for universal basic income. Of course, there are many developing countries has only limited physical space and sustainability issues. And not only just money, but I think I can raise this issue that when we're talking about universal basic income, we are not really talking about setting up institutions for social protection for the longer term. So this may be a kind of trade-off. So we need to be very careful. So we can think about when we establish social protection system, we also need to think about contribution system, benefit, and adequate administrative capability. That's the where we need to think in the longer term beyond COVID-19. So can you turn the next space? Okay, this is my analytical framework about the social security and social protection system. So if we divide the social protection program policy institution into four, these are the pictures. So one dividing line in the horizontal line is on the left-hand side, you have a provisional program without really institutional framework or relatively light institutional framework. On the right-hand side, you have an institutionalized program. So you need to have institutions and you need to building administrative capacity to learn this program. And in the one side is the social security, the downside is the social investment. So with these two criteria, you can divide the social protection in developing countries for a group of social protection, social policy instrument. So now, during the COVID crisis, we are on the left-hand side. So we need to respond quickly, and we don't need we don't have a time to establish institutions. We need to respond quickly. So like it's emergency. So when you have an emergency, you need to kind of emergency relief. That is more like a response to more like a safety net. But you can also think about social protection as investment during the emergency situation, or with a light institutional program, like a cash transfer program. Conditional cash transfer program doesn't really need a heavy institutions. But when we're talking about middle class, so now coming back to how we gap, fill the gap of this middle class, how can we provide the social protection for the poor? Well, instead of longer term thinking, short term thinking, when we try to cover middle class, missing middle class, is not kind of universal basic income. My argument is that we can come back to social security and with a heavy, more like administrative institutional program with longer term preparations. And of course, we can still think about emergency institutionally light program, but we don't have to think. My point is that we don't have to think all the time with a provisional program. When we think about beyond COVID-19, more solid social protection program in developing country, we also think longer term, more think about established institutions. So as I point out, even in the crisis, emergency crisis, the country with the more established framework, they respond quickly, respond better. So that is my thought to share with you. So next, please. So to summing up, to provide the social protection people in the developing countries. We need to think about extension of social security for informal sector, and also we need to think about building healthcare system. The reason also why some countries like Korea and Germany is responds better in the times of crisis, because we have a better healthcare system, which is not established in one day. You need to time. You need to think about building this system. And also, I think, but still we can think about universal child grant, especially poor household with children. We need to think about this kind of institutional right, but to provide support to everyone. But we need to mix. One is more like an institutional program. One is to more immediate and also go directly to the poor household. So at the beginning, I say that we shouldn't be complacent about COVID-19, even though first wave is moved out from Asia, but still it can come back again. So we need to first think about prevention, and then next to not only social protection, but we also think how we support the migrant workers in the developing country, or the people coming back to where they work. We need to think about their economic situation, and to recover public work project. This is also option we need to think once we lose out our lockdown policy, and also how to re-establish global production chain after this global crisis, because not only social protection, but we need to economic recovery. Okay, thank you very much, and I will stop here my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kwon. That was very enlightening. And thank you for highlighting a very important issue for governments to consider, the prospect of conditional versus unconditional cash transfers, and also the prospect of universal basic income. While attractive, you've also highlighted the major difficulty in mobilizing unconditional and universal basic income, and that of course is the fiscal space issue. And that actually leads us nicely into the next segment of today's webinar, and it will be a panel discussion entitled From Emergency to Recovery, Social Safety Nets Beyond the COVID-19 Pandemic. And there will be 3 additional speakers during this panel discussion who have not already spoken today. Others have already spoken.
I think we've lost you. Linda, we are lost. Can you say again?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just saying that the additional speakers during the panel discussion who have not already spoken today will be Peter Morgan. He is the Vice Chair of Research at the Asian Development Bank Institute. Michiel van der Ora is Senior Financial Sector Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. And also Nuno Kunha, he is Senior Social Protection Specialist at ILO in the Asian Regional Office in Bangkok. But first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the chair of the panel discussion, and that is Professor Tatsushi Sonobe. Professor Sonobe assumed the position of Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank in March of this year. And Professor Dean Sonobe will take us through the panel discussion today. Please go ahead, Dean Sonobe.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Because of time, I have just two questions, and then I will ask the first question to Nikhil and Nuno and Sonomi, and then the second question will be asked to Peter and the Professor Hakuji-kon. Okay, so my first question is this one. There has been much talk of new normal. This includes rethinking of approaches of social and economic development. So how do you foresee the crisis affecting your own work priorities and those of your institution? Okay, so let's go to Nikhil. Could you give us your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Dean. It's a very interesting question, and actually a question that we are debating amongst the colleagues in ADB. And to be fair, we don't really know the answer fully, because these are unique times, and there's not really a reference that we can fall back on that say, yeah, well, this is the right recipe. But this said, it's actually clear, I mean, the lockdown is being relaxed, and there's a lot of information now that we know that we didn't know before, and it's clear there's a spike in social protection expenditures and also in coverage in response of the lockdown, right? So World Bank is tracking these, and actually worldwide there's been programs that have been put in place in response, temporary programs put in place in response to the crisis. And the most frequent ones are the cash transfer program for the poor and the vulnerable. But then for the formal sector, there's also the unemployment benefit, the sickness benefit, and there's also the wage subsidies that basically trying to keep the workers in the workforce. So also in the region, most of the governments reacted really fast, and based on what we know from our programs with the governments, they all cover three parts of the three aspects of the crisis. And one is the health aspect, strengthening the health system. Second is the social protection schemes, targeting, get the money in the pockets of the people. And then three is the fiscal stimulus to keep the economy going, right? So and that has been across all countries, and basically a bit in the spirit of act fast and do whatever it takes. The governments have spent a lot of their funds to flatten the recession curve, and to avoid that there's long-lasting damage going forward to the economy. And initial assessments, like one in the ADB says that actually there is a softening of the impact of the COVID crisis, and if it's sustained, softening can actually go to 30-40% of the scenario that was in sight. So and the governments have been very creative in what they have been doing. So they have been building on existing systems and expanded, like for instance in the Philippines, they expanded the coverage from 7 million to 14 million poor people. And in case there's no existing scheme, then governments came up with new schemes, and basically based on self-selection, allowed people to claim their compensation. But it's also evident now that it's so much easier to start from an existing scheme to reach the people that you want to reach than to start from a new scheme. And you know, then you see that, you know, once implementation starts, that there's plenty of issues that come up and make it more difficult to reach the beneficiaries. Also, and Dr. Kwon touched on it a few times, that, you know, that there are weaknesses in the current interventions, that, you know, that not all groups have been reached as much as we wanted to, you know, we wanted them to be reached. There's the urban informal sector that actually took a big hit, but they're not considered amongst the poor, so they're not in the social registries. They're not in the formal sector, so they're not benefiting from the social, you know, the social insurance schemes neither. So they fall between two chairs, although they're firmly hit and actually fall under the category currently largely of the poor and the vulnerable. Another group that has been affected very hard is the migrant workers. They didn't only lose their livelihoods and the one for their families, but also going back to their home countries, they often fall outside the system, so they don't get any of the benefits that other people would benefit from. So quite difficult situation for them. And then overall, obviously, you know, the more vulnerable the population, they also take, you know, the hardest hit. And it has also been, you know, there's early evidence on that, on women, like Sonomi mentioned, elderly people, disabled, you know, they're all heavily affected. So that is basically in a nutshell what we learned from the lockdown. But looking forward and looking at the new normal, you know, it's unlikely that we will go back. You know, we don't know what will happen, but it's unlikely that the situation of pre-COVID-19 will come back, right? There's still the continued threat of the pandemic. There's talk about the second wave, not so much whether it will come, but when it will come. So there's need for continued vigilance and at the same time picking up the economic activities that, you know, that slowed down during the lockdown. So, you know, there's the situation of continued physical distancing, working from home, and then we see that some of the sectors are really harder hit than others. You know, like the retail sector, hotels, restaurants, construction, tourism has been badly hit, and that for you know, a while to come. So with this landscape in mind, you know, you have to look at the social protection programs will need to adjust to make that they're more efficient, that they're effective to address the new situation. I think one thing that we see is that, you know, the level of expenditures that took place during the lockdown, you know, they cannot be sustained. So they were given for 3 months, in some countries for 6 months, but they cannot go beyond that time, that period of time, because of the fiscal constraints. So there is need for more granularity. So looking at, you know, which sectors can take off and are no longer in need of support, and which sectors actually will need continued support, combined with, you know, the poor and vulnerable that actually, you know, that are still there and still will need to be covered. It's still a larger group than before the COVID-19. Another aspect that is there and important is the activation. You know, because of this, the lockdown and the impact of the crisis, there's a huge, a growing number of poor and unemployed, poor and vulnerable, but also unemployed. They need to get back to work as soon as possible in order to avoid scarring and in order to get the economy back going back. So there, you know, social protection as programs, you know, that can assist, you know, the workforce in finding a suitable job or skilling them for a suitable job, like employment services, job facilitation, reskilling, upskilling, but also public works. Not that like India is a good example where public works can actually absorb a large number in a very short period of time and get people back to work. Once the lockdown is over, basically. Another element that we see in the post-COVID period or in the new normal is that the low level of expenditure and the low coverage that was there or that is there in Asia and the Pacific. We have our the social protection indicator numbers. The average expenditure in Asia is 5.3% of GDP, and only half of the population that is intended to be covered is actually covered. So there's a huge underdeveloped situation for social protection, which now during the lockdown, there was this kind of a catch up, and we'll need to see what can remain of this catch up that took place, right? So, and one element is the informality. Dr. Kwon touched on that one as well. Can we nudge the informal sector into the formal sector? And my colleague from the ILO is working in Cambodia, and they're thinking of nudging some, by sector, informal sector workers, into formal sector arrangements, with a combination of social assistance and social insurance. And what about these unemployment and sickness benefit programs that have been rolled out in no time, often in countries where it didn't exist, has been rolled out? Are they going to be continued? Is there a space for these programs? They're great in addressing the providing the income protection when needed, but also as a counter-cyclical measure. So I think there's arguments to keep these programs going towards the future. And lastly, I would say the need to make social protection more shock responsive. So what we've seen now during the lockdown, that existing schemes can get expanded, new schemes can get created. What is the frame? Where can it be built from? How can it be done better during the next shock, which no doubt will come? How can it be done better than it has been done this time? Not that it has been done bad this time, but there were definitely, I think we can learn a lot from what we went through the last couple of months. So what do we expect for what ADB as whether it will affect our work? Yes, maybe I should have started with the short answer first, but for sure we can do much more. There will be much more challenges in the region and more work on social protection. It's we talk about colleagues and the requests are going up. So during the COVID, we have covered this social protection. We receive all these responses or requests for support, and already we start getting some responses for the post-COVID, the post-lockdown, I would say, not post-COVID, the post-lockdown, to start working with the governments as well.
So, thank you very much. For raising the important points comprehensively. Yes. Thanks. So then, Nuno Kunha of ILO, please give us your view or ILO's view.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's quite difficult, honestly, today to say something new. I was really impressive and see the alignment of most of the messages, starting by the gender, but then Dr. Kwon, it was really, really close to what I had prepared myself in some points, and then Mikhail kind of closed the cycle with the other elements. It's really good, but I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's really good to see that we have this alignment, and I think they touch most of the important points. In terms of our work, our work is being pretty much historically, I mean, dedicated to the expansion of social protection. I mean, supporting countries, I mean, through public policy advice, through elements like governance of schemes, administration of schemes, but mainly we talk about extension of what we call horizontal coverage, ensuring that more people are covered. And we have examples of this concern, this missing middle, also ensuring that like that universal child grant or universal pensions is also was one of, I remember to see it in a blog during the COVID by ADB too. I mean, we are having, for instance, a meeting tomorrow with Mikhail to discuss our joint work on the public finance management on social protection in Cambodia. That is very important too. And then we have the second level, that is the vertical dimension, ensuring that actually protection levels are also higher. And these link a lot with what Professor Dr. Kwan was mentioning about the social security, the insurance that of course provides higher levels of coverage, and with unemployment insurance, that we know there are more formal institutionalized measures for protecting people and very helpful during crisis. What I would maybe focus a little bit is to link, as most have been said in terms of social protection, is to link a little bit the discussion on, and we saw data yesterday from the World Bank on global prospects and economic projections for the next 2 years. And we see that we are looking at a crisis that is unprecedented. We are talking about going back to levels of growth only observed close to the 60s in the region. And what is the role of social protection in a crisis like this? What is the role of social protection in the recovery itself? What is the role of social protection in maybe a new economic model that needs to be discussed? We know that many countries depend too much in foreign direct investment. They depend too much. They have what we call export-led models. And we know that in the next 2 years, there will be very little access to the global demand is going down. What will be the markets they will sell? I mean, we look at countries again like Cambodia, Thailand. What will be the tourists? What will be, and this, I think, requires the thought on the model that that goes beyond social protection, but that includes social protection. And I was reading some papers yesterday on, because I'm working on some papers at regional level, and reading some papers on, for instance, the discussion on the 1997 crisis in Korea, and what has been the discussion since then in a more moving from export-led model and discussing the role of more income-based income growth model where domestic demand plays a higher role. Well, maybe the role of small enterprises is also different. The role of wages too. All this is quite interesting, but going back to social protection, we need to look what Mikhail was saying. The level of investment, it was indeed impressive suddenly, but still, if we look at the macro and the aggregate level of expenditure, annual expenditure on social protection, it still lags behind what, for instance, OECD countries spend, or let's say Japan spends, or even Korea spends, compared with most of the countries. I mean, this average hides actually huge heterogeneity in the region, while you have countries that spend and countries who almost don't have social protection. And without a significant investment in social protection, you don't have this redistribution, you don't have this promotion and the multiplier effect of social protection. And I think it's time to think on this life cycle approach, on the role of different transfers. It's time to think indeed on the formalization, because I think I have years and years working with governments, and I feel it's sometimes we are talking about the informal workers and not everyone really perceives what we are talking about. But I think the crisis made them visible. It was clear that governments wanted to do something about. Maybe we need to use this opportunity to think, why is it so difficult to formalize the jobs? Maybe because the costs of formalization are too high. Maybe we need to have systems that are more designed to answer to their needs. I think it's time to do a reflection on all these. I think opportunities like the one today are actually very good to bring our brains together. I don't think anyone has an answer, and Michael was very clear on it. But I think we need to use this as an opportunity. I think it should not be business as usual, should be build back better, and we should not specially allow to what happened in 2008, that I felt that we forgot very closely this human dimension of the crisis, to go back just to more the fiscal thought, the public debt, and we went back to normal very quickly. I think this time we cannot afford to do it again. And it's with this message that I would like to contribute to the panel, but I think we have a lot to discuss in the future about this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Nuno, for the need of the kind of human touch. Okay, and then I'd like to ask Sonomi-san. Sonomi-san has already touched upon the new normal in her presentation. So you can reiterate your points, and also you can add the new points.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll keep it very short, but the question was also to do with because I represent the ADB's gender equality approach to gender equality in Asia Pacific, and then how we can help accelerate these countries' development of improving the gender equality situation. And then COVID obviously has had the major impact already in terms of reversing back the good trend of narrowing gender inequalities in the past. I don't know how many years backwards we have gone, but economists have been punching numbers to figure out how many backwards, but even without it, the UN was calculating that if the labor force participation rate and the other situation continues, it takes 120 years for the gender equality in the labor market to come. So, with COVID, probably it might have come to, I don't know, 200 more years. But so I would just reiterate one important issue, which is unless we address this fundamental issue of the care economy, which is both on the human development side of caring the next generation or caring the older generation or caring anyone who's sick or vulnerable within the household, that needs to be redistributed, not just within the household between men and women, but also with the society, with the employers. And without that, the situation of the economic empowerment of the vulnerable groups, and it's not just women, but also more intersectionalities of women with other disadvantages, and then in informal sector, these are not going to be changing. And then again and again, we'll have the same situation, and then after the crisis is over, then the women will always chase to look for a job in the lowest paid sectors or the situation with the lowest benefits. So that will there's so many things that I want to say, but I would just leave it to one most important point from a gender perspective, so the care economy. And then I see Nano being there, and the ILO has been on the forefront, and this is going to be a very important partnership across different institutions, as well as the governments and also the private sector, to support this effort. So I'll just stop there, and then I'll also add one more thing, which is that this whole new normal have pointed out the importance of the gender equality and putting women and then girls at the center of development. It's really, really crucial. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mikhail and Nuno and Sonomi-san, there may be some questions from audience, so please stay with us. Then I'd like to go to the second question, which will be asked Peter and Professor Kwon. In developing and developed economies alike, government debt dramatically increased to finance massive COVID-19 fiscal support programs. In addition, the economic growth prospects are diminished significantly worldwide. How can developing economies create the fiscal space required to finance safety nets, healthcare, and education? Okay, Peter, please unmute your mic.
Yes, thanks very much. I think when one talks about fiscal space and fiscal stimulus, one has to very much separate the cyclical and structural aspects. In the short term, obviously we need fiscal stimulus, and countries have moved quite strongly to implement the various kinds of fiscal stimulus measures. And I'm actually not aware of any great stress that emerged in countries as a result of these big increases in government debt. I think in that situation, fiscal space is not the issue. The question is the ability of the market to absorb those additional debt levels. And typically, what you find in a recession anyway is that savings rates go up, and so interest rates go down, and debt is absorbed relatively easily. And secondly, the central bank can step in as a buyer of last resort. Now that's typically easier in countries like Japan, where you have current account deficits and very low interest rates. Developing countries may have greater constraints on the ability of central banks to buy government debt, because there'll be worries about monetization and potential capital flight, currency crisis, that sort of thing. And I think that's where other sources of potential funding come in, like the special funds from the IMF or the multilateral banks, which can help to support additional government expenditures. But those are basically all relatively short term, and as I mentioned, maybe 3 to 6 months horizon in terms of those big spending measures. But when you're talking about expansion of the social safety net on a structural basis, then it really becomes a question of how you either create fiscal space by cutting spending elsewhere, or by increasing tax revenues or contributions to various kinds of social protection schemes. And the advantage there, perhaps, is that a lot of Asian countries still have relatively young populations. So when it comes to, if you had a system for getting Social Security premiums, for example, those could probably fund the retired population fairly easily. The big problem there, as Nuno mentioned, is you have in many countries these very large informal sectors where it's very difficult to set up those kinds of Social Security and social protection schemes. And so I think that's the real bottleneck, perhaps, as opposed to fiscal space per se.
Thank you, Peter, for a clear explanation. And then Professor Kwon, how about your thought?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, before I really answer your question directly, I just like to briefly mention about the new normal. People here as well mentioned about we are going to see new normal. But my question is that when we see a new normal, we need to ask, what is the new norm? I mean, we will see new situation, but I don't know whether we have a new norm. For example, coming back to your questions, that if we have increasing or extending our social security or social support for the poor, or increasing social security system, informal sector, then I think we need a new norm, not just accepting what we have so far. I think we need to change our thinking, and also we need to establish our new norm to respond to new normal. That's my thinking. And also, Nuno mentioned about the Korea's response to economic crisis in 1997. Well, I had one paper about that, and maybe I will send you an email about this paper. But my main point is that Korea's major response to economic crisis was strengthening social protection. So it's making pension program universal, making healthcare program universal, and also we introduce living standard guarantee, which is kind of a social assistance program. So after 20 years, we have this COVID-19, and we were able to mobilize not only emergency resource, but also we can mobilize our institution for social protection, including healthcare. So then probably in the future, we will have a very difficult economic situation. And I think we need a new norm here as well. So, well, in the developing country, to extend social protection, you need money. Where is the money coming from? And then we need to think about new norm. Why don't we establish mobilizing domestic finance through more institutionalized tax system? Why don't we establish the contribution system for pension, healthcare? I mean, if we just accept it, this is very difficult. We just to respond in a more provisional, quick way. Then after crisis, we'll be in the same situation again and again. So I mean, probably I don't know whether you see this is realistic or this is more idealistic from academic, but as a public policy scholar, I think we need to think establishing more institutional way, because informal sector, by definition, they are not included in the institutional framework. So we extend our institutions in terms of taxation, in terms of social security, we can reduce informal sector. But at the same time, I think I have to be very, very clear that our market situation, global demand will be very difficult, so that the financial space will be limited, at least in the short term. I think that's where the international community, even though most of countries, affluent society, they have their problems, and also policymakers looking internally rather than globally. But I think we need to raise these issues that we need the international cooperation in this time. But at the same time, we also need to think about more longer term institutional response. So that's my answer to your question. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you very much for raising a very interesting point. It's a really important question. What's the new norm? And then my question immediately is that, what kind of new norm are people willing to accept? And the majority of people. Yeah. So, for example, 20 years ago, the Labour Party leaders in the UK, although they are Labour Party people, but they are talking only about efficiency, government effectiveness, those things. But then 10 years ago, the books on income inequality became the best hit in the world. And then people are more talking about, you know, inequality or how to deal with tech giants, that kind of things. The people, you know, way of thinking has been changing. And then we have had the pandemic. So there must be, you know, some big change in the way of thinking among people. But if they are, you know, adopting new ideas in totally different directions, then there will be no big change. But I think there seems to be a kind of, you know, alignment. People are moving toward a similar direction. So what do you feel in Korea, for example?
My first reaction to your question is that, for example, the Korean society has a big problem of low fertility rate. We are going to lose our population as Japan did before. And the governments put a lot of money to increase the rate of fertility. But I think we need a new norm, not just the money. For example, between the husband and wife, what we need a new norm between within the family, and also we need a norm between the family and firm, and we need a new norm between people. Without that thinking, I don't think money will raise the fertility rate, for example, in Korea. Another new norm, I think so far we work very hard to be very efficient in the economic activity, but during this effort, we lose a lot of middle class. And once you lose a middle class, I think it's not just the economy, but it is also politics, and also social conflict is very intense in many countries. And the economic cost in the longer term, you can save a lot of money from the efficiency in the market, but later you should pay for that. So I think after COVID-19, I think we need to think about how to respond to this, not only traditional economic social response. I think we need to think about how we think about the relation between family and between men and women, and how the employees and the firm and the state. That's, I think, my input. We need a new norm as well, not only new normal.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think the many participants, really want to say something. So I'd like to ask Linda to moderate the Q&A session. So this ends the panel discussion part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Sonobe. There are a few questions from the audience. I'll just go to the first question. This is from, I hope I'm getting the pronunciation correctly. It's from Aditi Garg. With COVID-19, there has been absolutely no demand in the market and nobody wants to spend. How can the central bank intervene to relax some constraints and to provide liquidity in the market? This question is for Peter Morgan.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Yeah, I think it's a difficult situation for central banks. Typically, in many countries, interest rates were already relatively low in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and things like that. So the scope to ease policy significantly has not been that great. And then when we talk about providing liquidity, that is basically means injecting liquidity into the banking sector. But if banks are cautious and don't want to lend more money, then you're still not going to get much effect out of that. So I think that's why the fiscal policy stimulus measures have been very important. The direct cash transfers to the population, which provide ready cash and also give people a sense of greater security, which enables them to spend more. So I think the central bank can maybe operate most effectively by trying to accommodate that expansion in fiscal policy, as I mentioned earlier, by buying more government bonds, for example.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that response. Next, I would like to go to the Deputy Dean of ADBI, Chulju Kim, who has a question.
Actually, thank you very much. Actually, this is not a question, but just a comment on the relationship between the social safety net and then fiscal sustainability. On the critical issue of fiscal space, fiscal sustainability, and more broadly, economic recovery related to social safety net, the message deployed in response to pandemic. I think it is critically important to design such social protection programs in a way to reduce macroeconomic vulnerability and building resilience against downturns. One such way is to enhance automatic stabilizer, which are mechanisms built into government budget that raise spending or reduce taxes when economy slows. They include, for example, on the revenue side, progressive income taxes, or spending side, unemployment benefit and various social safety nets. And another way is to prepare in advance high-quality measures that can be deployed quickly when downside risk materialize. Well-prepared, counter-critical discretionary measures are highly effective as fiscal multipliers tend to be larger in downturns. Such measures are particularly appropriate in response to deep and prolonged downturns where support through existing automatic stabilize and social safety net is not sufficient. And one option is to enact such measures that will be automatically activated, kind of the rule-based fiscal stimulus. For example, on the expenditure side, this includes a temporary extension of coverage, a duration of unemployment benefits, or well-targeted transfers to low-income or liquidity constrained households. So what I'm saying is that if we design a social safety net properly, then it could contribute to restore fiscal sustainability, fiscal space in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Dean Kim. We have another question from the audience. This is from Paras Porla. He a student at Punjab University, Chandigarh, India. Every stimulus requires certain time for implementing its potential to accomplish its goals. So that can generate a gap, maybe short or long term. How in the meantime can economic agents react for putting their economies on track? And could you please elaborate in the context of the production sector, household sector, government or local authorities? Would anyone from the panel like to take that on briefly? Anyone from the panel?
Well, I can answer a little bit. I think the stimulus, the quickest kind of stimulus, I think, comes from the cash transfers to households if it can be implemented quickly. I think for example, Korea, as I understand, implemented cash transfers very quickly because they already had the transfer mechanism set up. Japan has been much slower. I got my application, I think, a week or so ago, and I sent it in, but so far no money. So that's maybe the front line of response. Obviously, when you then talk about, for example, public works spending, that depends, as Deputy Dean Kim said, if you have kind of a shelf of projects that are ready to implement, then you can move fairly quickly. But I think it has to be a multi-pronged response. You need responses, both direct cash injections to households. Also, in terms of companies, I think one of the measures that works very automatically and quickly is these tax holidays where you don't have to make your tax payments right away. So that automatically injects cash into companies. So I think there are ways that can work fairly quickly.
Thank you very much, Peter. One final question is about the prospects for leveraging existing digital finance technology to reach Asia's unbanked. And I will just quickly respond to this by way of just the salient point from a presentation that we were not able to hear because of audio issues. It was from Liu Dongwang, the president of CD Finance, and just very briefly, he says that there were really two key enabling aspects for digital progress with microfinance with his company in rural counties in China for accessing through the pandemic. And first, the government had been intensifying telecommunication infrastructure development in impoverished and rural areas. And second, smartphones have a high penetration in rural China. And therefore, he concluded that the pandemic has therefore shone a light on the importance of digital lending in the future due to advantages of convenience, quickness, and non-contact. And therefore, going forward, CD Finance and other microcredit companies believe that digital technology can play a much bigger role in expanding microcredit and financial services to rural areas in China. And with that, I think we will conclude the Q&A, and I will now turn it back to Dean Sonobe for closing remarks. Dean Sonobe.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, to answer can I answer that question? No time? Yeah, let me try. So traditionally, if the government cannot help people, then the community would try to help people. And then in the context of Japan, for example, the companies, the private firms are kind of community because workers, work together and they stay together maybe longer times than their family members. So they are in the community. So if something happened, then maybe the employer, the boss would be responsible. That's a social norm in Japan. Or in the society like Bangladesh, maybe the community, village, or the sorry, I failed to unmute. Okay, it's okay now. Yeah, and then NGOs play a very important role in society like Bangladesh. So the microfinance would lend money. And then, of course, those small businesses cannot repay. So microfinance will have a crisis. Or in the case of Japan, as Peter said, the government is very slow to respond. So money, relief money, do not reach the people. So those employers have to borrow money from some nice financial institutions. And then their business will be in crisis. And then those nice lenders, very kind, generous lenders will have also insolvency problem. So then what will happen? So even after the public health crisis is over, the economic recovery will be very slow because of those debt, or some debt becomes bad debt. So rather than that, it might be better to just fire the workers and then let the government pay the unemployment insurance. That might be better. So it depends on the type of the crisis or disaster. If the shock comes to particular village or region, like an earthquake, then that region can borrow money or can expect assistance from other regions. So if the crisis is at the national level, the country can expect the help from the other countries. But this pandemic is really pandemic, so really global. Maybe the international organization and maybe the government, that kind of very big organization, we borrow money under their big strong strong trustworthiness on those things, and then the the problem of bad debt that will be drag on recovery. That kind of thing can be avoided. So my answer is usually if the government response is slow, then community should help and would help. But this kind of situation, it may be may not be a good idea to expect that kind of intermediate organization to try to help individuals. Okay, so my closing remark is like this. Even before the outbreak of the pandemic, it was widely recognized that although safety nets for vulnerable people are important, it's difficult to cast safety nets to really reach vulnerable people. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, we have recognized that the coverage of safety nets must be wider and they must reach vulnerable people more quickly. But doing so is an enormous and daunting task with a significant number of informal workers, migrant workers, and women in poor households. Last week and today, we have had a three-part webinar series. It aims to provide insights into how COVID-19 is affecting developing Asia, particularly the most vulnerable segments of society, and also the insight about how the government and society can cast safety net to reach them. As the organizing team of this webinar series expected, we have learned a lot from experts about what technology can offer a solution that makes it possible to rapidly scale up safety nets. And we have also learned a lot from senior government officials from Pakistan, the Philippines, and India, such valuable first-hand and real-time lessons. I think that these three webinars were a great success, and I thank all speakers, panelists, and those who actively participated asking questions for their great contributions. Countries are slowly beginning to reopen, but the negative effect of containment measures on Asia economies is expected to last for years. The most negatively affected sectors may experience permanent damage, thereby resulting in permanent job losses. All of this points to the need for continued safety net coverage, even after containment measures have been lifted. After the pandemic is well and truly behind us, there will be a sense of relief, but it should not be a time to leave safety net unattended. We learned from the country case studies that existing safety nets play critically important roles in a quick implementation of emergency cash transfer programs. To borrow Professor Kwon's expression, institutional framework cannot be built in one day. So here is a quote making the rounds in social media. When fishermen cannot go to sea, they repair their nets. So with this in mind, ADBI invites further collaboration with policymakers and experts on this important topic to help ensure that safety nets are stronger and well prepared for future crises. More concretely, I am interested in holding another series of webinars on the same or closely related issues and conducting case studies of recent safety net experiences in the Philippines and Pakistan. Anyway, thank you very much for participating and contributing to this webinar series. And please participate more in the next opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Sonobe, and that concludes this three-part series. Thank you to all the speakers again, and to all of the audience for joining us. Goodbye from Tokyo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kwon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Thank you, Sonomi-san.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.